Well, the consequences of the war after 1 week are staggering. Death and destruction on the ground in Ukraine, a massive exodus of refugees, as we've just been hearing, scenes of fierce resistance from Ukrainian soldiers and ordinary people as well, and a president who's rallied much of the world around his cause. Meanwhile, Russia has become increasingly isolated and its economy is in freefall. Let's take a closer look back now at the events of the past week.
It started with a speech. Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a special military operation in Ukraine. He said he would demilitarize and denazify the country. And an all-out assault on Ukraine started. People took refuge wherever they could, like here in Kyiv's subway stations. While the bombardments above grew more intense across the country. This is the result of relentless airstrikes and rounds of shelling. Hundreds of thousands of people have fled Ukraine, what the UN Refugee Agency is calling Europe's greatest refugee crisis this century. Heading to neighboring countries, they're mainly women and children.
To save my life of my baby, and my husband's life.
Bombing. Well, for the first time I saw a field strewn with missiles and a forest that is just razed to the ground. All night long we have had planes flying all the time, air raid alarms. Men are required to stay and fight. I'm going to Ukraine. I will not say more. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Ukrainians have put up a stiff fight. Both sides have incurred heavy losses. Russian morale is reported to be low, and some forces are reported to have surrendered or sabotaged their own vehicles. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, refused to leave the capital. When the U.S. offered him safe passage out, he said he needed ammunition, not a ride. He spoke movingly to Western leaders. We are fighting for our rights, for our freedoms, for life, for our life. And now we are fighting for survival, and this is the highest motivation. But we are also fighting to be equal members of Europe. So prove that you are with us. Prove that you will not let us go. Prove that you are indeed Europeans, and then life will win over death, and light will win over darkness. Glory be to Ukraine. Europe and the U.S. have responded with crushing sanctions on Russia, cutting off its banks from much of the world. Regulators closed the stock market to stop panic selling. Russians lined up at cash machines afraid the economy would go into freefall. As the sanctions piled up, Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert and escalated bombardments. A week into the war, an armored convoy more than 60 kilometers long is moving slowly toward Kyiv. Hundreds of tanks, artillery, and personnel carriers. For those still in the city, the fight may have just begun, and the worst may be yet to come.
We're going to cross now to Ed Arnold. He's a research fellow for European security at the Russi Defence and Security think tank in London. Ed, when you look at this war, what are some of the things that stand out to you from a security perspective?
So I think the first thing is the preparation on the Russian side has been very poor. It's worth noting that since 2008, and when the Russians were a military offensive in Georgia, there was a sweeping Russian modernization of its forces. So we were expecting the Russians to fight far better than they have thus far. I think key to that has been poor political and military leadership, and ultimately that the soldiers on the ground were not actually told much about the operation and the scale of it until the 11th hour, just before they invaded last Thursday. In contrast to that, the Ukrainian will to fight has been exemplary. Their moral components in terms of their leadership and morale has been excellent, and actually has been decisive in the initial stages of this war. But now we're moving to a more difficult stage for the Ukrainian armed forces.
This week, your think tank published an article warning a frustrated Putin is a dangerous one. What do you mean by that? And are we seeing signs of frustration from the Russian president?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, this operation has not gone according to plan from Putin. I think it was very difficult for the military to turn his political objectives into realistic military objectives. They made assumptions about the Ukrainian will to fight, and also assumptions about how quickly they would be able to take Kiev and remove President Zelensky and probably put in a government that was more sympathetic to Moscow. And that's had real consequences. The fact that they were not able to do it so quickly has caused other issues. And really now they have tried to move to actually fight how the Russian way of warfare suggests, which is the heavy use of artillery, the heavy use of air power, use of overwhelming force. I don't think they went there initially because they wanted to limit civilian casualties and destruction of critical national infrastructure, because they wanted a new government to be able to govern the country. So the more indiscriminate the attacks and the more brutal the fighting gets for the key population centres, there's actually less favourable political options for Putin. So there's a bit of an issue here with timing, that the Russians need to secure objectives very quickly to prevent the lowering of even already low morale. But this takes time, and they're taking far heavier casualties than they thought they ever would.
What about further escalation? How concerned are people in your field, for example, about the threat of nuclear war?
Well, I think the first point to note is that this is not a nuclear crisis. I believe that the nuclear posturing on the Russian side is very much to do with trying to warn NATO off further escalation and further support to Ukraine. So I think the first point to note, this is not a nuclear crisis. However, this is a situation that could escalate further very quickly. So, for example, NATO is supplying lethal aid. NATO countries, is supplying lethal aid to Ukraine. It's not inconceivable to come up with some certain scenarios that actually puts Russian forces and NATO forces very close together, and then that could escalate in a number of ways. So the risk is there, and I think planners on the Western side are taking that very seriously.
And an escalation is also linked to the calls for a no-fly zone. There have been many calls for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, including from Ukrainian President Zelensky himself. Many on the other side saying that's not a good idea. Explain to us why that wouldn't be a good idea.
I think that it just makes the risk of escalation even greater. I mean, there are multiple ways of enforcing a no-fly zone in terms of what's allowed in and what's not, and whether certain aircraft are allowed in, or it's just a blanket ban on the airspace. But essentially it would mean that whoever was enforcing the no-fly zone would have to potentially suppress air defence assets, which are located in Russia and Belarus, in order to protect their own personnel and fighter pilots. So it's tantamount to really declaring war on Russia. And one very recent example, unfortunately yesterday, a Romanian MiG-21 went down over the Black Sea, and also the search and rescue helicopter that went to retrieve the pilot also went down due to weather. However, it's an event, unfortunately, that just shows how escalation could occur, because you need to verify the information and verify how it went down. Of course, Romania is a NATO member. So I think enforcing a no-fly zone is just a significant escalation, and I just don't think it would practically work over Ukraine at the moment.
Ed, thanks very much for breaking that down for us. Ed Arnold, European security analyst at the Russia Defence think tank. The United Nations General Assembly has adopted a resolution demanding Russia immediately stops using force against Ukraine and withdraws its military from the country. The historic non-binding resolution was backed by 141 out of 193 member states, with only 5 countries voting against. Before the vote, Ukraine's ambassador to the UN accused Russia of seeking to commit genocide in his country and called on the world to stand together against Moscow's aggression. Here's UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres speaking after the vote.
The General Assembly has spoken. As Secretary-General, it is my duty to stand by this resolution and be guided by its call. The message of the General Assembly is loud and clear. End hostilities in Ukraine now, silence the guns now, open the door to dialogue and diplomacy now. The territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine must be respected in line with the UN Charter. We don't have a moment to lose. The brutal effects of the conflict are plain to see. But as bad as the situation is for the people in Ukraine right now, it threatens to get much, much worse. The ticking clock is a time bomb. Looking ahead, I will continue to do everything in my power to contribute to an immediate cessation of hostilities and urgent negotiations for peace. People in Ukraine desperately need peace, and people around the world demand it.
Well, let's get more from DW political correspondent Julia Saldelli. Julia, this resolution is non-binding, so can it really make any difference?
Well, if we expect Russia to now suddenly stop the war because of this resolution, that is not going to happen. Even though the resolution says they should immediately withdraw their troops from Ukraine, Putin is not going to do that just because the UN General Assembly decided that. But nonetheless, it is a strong signal, and especially it's rare. It doesn't really happen that often that the Security Council convenes the General Assembly to vote on such a resolution. The last time it happened was in 1982. So that is already a signal of the importance of this vote. And also, we've seen that Ukraine has garnered quite a bit of support from the majority of members of the General Assembly, and also some countries that traditionally might support Russia have abstained from the vote. So on the one hand, it's not legally binding, but it puts pressure on Russia, and it shows that the international community is strongly behind Ukraine. And it also is a diplomatic victory for Ukraine. And also, if we look at the vote in the Security Council earlier, sure, Russia has a right to veto. So Russia vetoed a resolution condemning the war. But out of 15 members, 11 voted in favor of the resolution and 3 abstained. So overall, quite a strong signal in support of Ukraine.
You touched on it there, but tell us a little bit more about those traditional friends of Russia who voted against, including Cuba and Serbia, for example.
Yes, these are countries that are traditionally close with Russia, and it was expected that they would support Russia. But what we've seen is that actually they didn't vote with Russia, so against the resolution, but they abstained. Now, that shows that some of these countries are in a tricky situation. Russia had even put forward a diplomatic effort to try to closen ties with these countries and try to get them even more on that side. It sent some officials, for example, to Cuba to talk to members of the government there. But Cuba did end up abstaining, and that is because Cuba is walking a fine line. On the one hand, they haven't fully endorsed Russia, but they also haven't openly condemned its actions. And the non-endorsement is also because Cuba is nervous about what its trade partners, for example, in Europe, might do if it goes clearly with Russia. But then we have the case of South Africa, which also abstained, and that was maybe a bit of a surprise for some. And South Africa has put out a statement explaining their vote, saying that they find that the resolution itself does not create the right environment for diplomacy to take place, and that the UN should push for diplomacy in the first place, and that they also find that the resolution does not address the security concerns that Russia has. So in some way, sort of giving credit to what Russia has been saying in the last few weeks.
You talk about that diplomacy, that all-important word here. I mean, what does this mean if it doesn't have any real-life implications and it's not going to, cause Russia to withdraw? What does it mean diplomatically for them?
It certainly shows that Russia is isolated right now. The few countries that openly voted against the resolution are themselves considered also pariah states. I mean, it was Russia itself, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and clearly, the international community is not standing with Russia right now. But that does not mean that the West is now just going to close all ways of dialogue with Russia. There is still hope that talking to Russia might bring the country to stop the war. That's something that also German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said yesterday. It's now time to give diplomacy a chance and hope that dialogue can bring this conflict to an end quickly, even though it wasn't really good at preventing that conflict in the first place.
Yeah. All right, Julia Saldelli, thanks very much for explaining that for us. Well, here are some more headlines from this war. Hundreds of Ukrainian civilians have blocked streets to stop Russian troops reaching Europe's largest nuclear power plant. A video on social media shows civilian-built roadblocks around the plant in the southeast Ukrainian town of Enerhodar. Russia claimed this week to have taken the town. Ukraine denies this. Police in Moscow have detained a group of children for laying flowers at the Ukrainian embassy, according to a social media user. Some were as young as 7. People were also arrested in St. Petersburg. A monitoring group says more than 8,000 anti-war protesters have been detained in the past week. More than 40,000 people gathered in the German city of Munich on Wednesday to protest the war. The crowd was 10 times larger than organisers had anticipated and one of the biggest demonstrations the city has seen in years.